It's UN week here in New York City. The traffic is terrible, the security is worse, the good restaurants are booked solid. It's the only time of the year when you can walk down the street and see a head of state trying to hail a cab. This actually did happen to me once. I saw Tony Blair standing in the middle of Lexington Avenue trying to get a taxi and failing. True story. Local man turned two-time American president Donald J. Trump returning home this week to address the 80th gathering of the United Nations General Assembly. His trip involving a broken escalator, a broken teleprompter, and a scorched earth address in which he lambasted the countries represented by those gathered in the Great Hall as, quote,
going to hell.
Oh, and he made some big news on the war in Ukraine. I'm Carlo Versano, and this is how Donald Trump took on the world this week from the White House, Turtle Bay edition. If you missed the president's address to the UN on Tuesday, it was essentially the same speech he's been giving everywhere these days, a slightly updated version of his stump speech from the campaign.
In my first term, I built the greatest economy in the history of the world. We had the best economy ever, history of the world.
But it's helpful to break down his remarks, I think, into three buckets: war, immigration, and climate. It's also Climate Week, after all, though that seems to be a project we've more or less given up on for the moment. But the big news was made at the UN after Trump delivered his meandering address in a Truth Social post, whereby the president signaled that he was going all in on Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Whoa there, that's a pretty big turnabout. It was only 6 weeks ago, remember, that Trump flew to Alaska for that summit with Vladimir Putin that yielded no apparent breakthrough, except perhaps the legitimization of Putin in the West. Now, we don't know what any intelligence or other information preceded this change of heart. The president did meet with Zelensky just before his post, but Trump no longer saying that Kyiv has to give up territory for peace, going so far as to suggest Ukraine could invade Russia. That's a welcome development probably for those on the side of Ukraine's ability to continue this war indefinitely. And to the extent that there had been progress on the Russian side of things since Alaska,
Putin ought to stop.
It appears that that is now on ice.
6 years have passed since I last stood in this grand hall and addressed a world that was prosperous and at peace in my first term. Since that day, the guns of war have shattered the peace I forged on two continents.
Trump's UN address was fairly boilerplate, at least for him. He blamed Joe
Biden
a lot. He made up a couple new words like
unendable.
He complained about getting no credit for the
Abraham Accords.
There's some truth to that, actually. He also mentioned the Nobel Peace Prize that he definitely does not covet.
Everyone says that I should get the Nobel Peace Prize,
The voting of which starts in just a couple weeks.
What is the purpose of the United Nations? The UN has such tremendous potential.
Now, Trump also used the address at the UN to blame the body for creating new problems like, quote, uncontrollable migration, saying this:
Proud nations must be allowed to protect their communities and prevent their societies from being overwhelmed by people they have never seen before, with different customs, religions, with different everything.
He urged other nations to take his hardline approach to immigration, offering the following rather stark assessment.
You want to be politically correct, and you're destroying your heritage.
And he spent the balance of his remarks taking on what he continues to call the, quote, climate hoax, claiming that any country trying to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy sources would be doomed.
All green is all bankrupt.
He also brushed off the concept of a, quote, carbon footprint as nonsense.
The carbon footprint is a hoax, made up by people with evil intentions.
Now, he happens to be right about this. The concept of a carbon footprint is a piece of advertising propaganda that we owe to BP, British Petroleum, which in the early 2000s was looking for a way to absolve big oil from its hand in warming the planet, and shifting that blame onto you and I. Some ad man on Madison Avenue came up with the idea of an individual carbon footprint, which people still use today as if it's some kind of meaningful data point that whether or not you turn off the light in the bathroom actually contributes meaningfully to global warming, which it doesn't.
It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion.
So in the hour-long speech, which is the longest Trump has ever delivered at the UN, by the way, the president calling for the release of all the hostages in Gaza.
Just release the hostages, man.
That's one of the few applause lines he got in the room, and also criticized those countries and allies like France, the UK, and Canada, which recently moved to recognize Palestinian statehood.
The rewards would be too great for Hamas terrorists for their atrocities. This would be a reward for these horrible atrocities.
Aside from that new tone on Ukraine, Trump did not really suggest the U.S. was any closer to brokering ceasefires in either Ukraine or Gaza, which are the two big theaters that he has promised but thus far failed to end. And his pivot on Ukraine, I think, could really be read a couple of ways. Now, Trump famously has a tendency to listen to the last person he speaks to on a given topic, the last guy in the room. In this case, that would be Zelensky. And he could easily pivot once again next time Putin decides to engage in some form of presidential flattery. The other way to look at it is that this is Trump basically preparing to give up and cut bait on his efforts to end this war, leaving it to the Europeans as their problem. This is all evidenced by the way he ended his missive by wishing both countries well and signing off, "Good luck to all." And boy, are we going to need it.